evening, everyone. My name is Liz Artlip. I'm a member of the event staff, and I want to welcome you all tonight to Politics and Prose at the Wharf. Just a couple of quick notes before we get started. If you've not already done so, please do take a moment to silence your cell phones. Keep them on. We love to see pictures, tweets, snaps, whatever you'd like to do. Just make sure you do it silently. That is for a couple of reasons. One, we do audio recordings of all our events for archive purposes, and we also have C-SPAN Book TV here with us tonight. So you don't want to be the person whose phone goes off on national television. So we don't want to hear cell phones. We do want to hear your questions, though. When we get to the question and answer portion of the event, there is an audience Q&A mic set up right here in the middle. If you have a question, which we highly encourage, please do step up to the mic and speak into the mic to make sure that everyone here hears it and it gets picked up on all of our recordings. So if you are here tonight, odds are that probably means you like interesting books about fascinating history and perhaps in particular American history. We have generally over the course of a year close to 1,000 and now coming up on probably over 1,000 next year events at Politics and Prose across our 3 locations. And a lot of them are history themed. So just a couple that might pique your interest in the coming weeks. October 21st at our Connecticut Avenue store, we have Ben McIntyre for his book, The Spy and the Traitor. And then November 14th here at the Wharf, we have H.W. Brands coming in for his book, Heirs of the Founders. Both of those are some really stellar American history books that might be worth a return trip. But that is not why we're here tonight. Tonight we are here for Nathaniel Philbrick for his new book, In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. The Battle of Chesapeake took place on September 5th, 1781, and assured American victory at Yorktown. While it's rightly considered one of the most important naval engagements in world history, it's also been one of the most misunderstood battles of the Revolutionary War. Standard accounts leave out the fact that no Americans took part in this momentous confrontation. Rather, thanks to Washington's foresight months earlier, French warships had been mobilized to fight against the British. In his new analysis, Nathaniel Philbrick, author of award-winning books including In the Heart of the Sea and Mayflower, follows Washington from his realization in the fall of 1780 that he needed the French Navy's help, and details the general's subsequent negotiations and the logistics that made his plan such a triumphant reality. Now, please help me welcome Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you. It is great to be here. It's just settling in that I have been writing about the revolution now since 2010, which means I have been working on the revolution, writing and researching books for as long as the revolution occurred, so eight years. And it began with Bunker Hill. I live on Nantucket Island, an island of about 15,000 people year-round. And I realized that Boston, in the Revolutionary period, was an island, a 1.1 square mile island connected by a thin neck of land to Roxbury with a population of 15,000. And a lot of my books are about groups of people under enormous stress, whether it's a crew of a whale ship that's just been rammed by a whale, 102 pilgrims bound for a coast that they know nothing about. I was interested in what was going to happen to the citizens of Boston as they endured the enormous stresses of a revolution. And the Battle of Bunker Hill was the obvious climax of that book, but I found myself unexpectedly fascinated with the man who appeared a few weeks later to take over command of the Army, George Washington. This was not the George Washington who had stared at me at the $1 bill for all my life. This was a guy in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery, and aggressive in a way that surprised me. And so I realized I just got to keep following the story. I would then write Valiant Ambition that pairs Washington with Benedict Arnold, where we watch over the course of 4 years as Washington emerges as a leader who's really trying to figure things out into what he would ultimately become, the leader that realizes the only way we're going to hang in here is if we avoid that conflict that might destroy the army. We got to play a kind of rope-a-dope tactic, a defensive war, which was completely against he was aggressive by temperament, but he knew this was best for his country. And then with Benedict Arnold, who decides he's the one man whose job it is to tear this country apart. And that book ends with Arnold's unsuccessful attempt to turn over West Point to the British, and in the late summer and fall of 1780. And it was after writing that book that I realized, okay, now I really have to find out what happens to Washington. And, you know, I'm a water guy, and it's great to be here on the wharf because I live on an island. I grew up in that maritime center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But we have rivers, and I realized from an early age that, you know, before there were multi-lane highways, before there were railroads, it was water by which things were transported, whether it was an army or provisions, and rivers were essential. And in Valiant Ambition, it's the Hudson River, which is the great strategic point that is being fought over. But I have to say, not even I, with my maritime bias, appreciated the extent to which the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, would contribute, would determine the ultimate fate of the American Revolution. You know, I think I grew up thinking of the Revolution as kind of a linear progression, each battle as a stepping stone to ultimate victory. What I've learned through these 8 years of researching and writing, it wasn't that at all. We lost our way by the fall of 1780. We had launched into this revolution because we didn't want to pay taxes to the British. It turned out we did not want to pay the taxes required to fund Washington's army. His army was withering on the vine. Recruitment levels were embarrassingly low. And Washington realized that the only hope he had for winning this conflict was with their ally, the French. The French had entered the war in 1778, soon after the great victory at Saratoga. And what Washington realized from the very beginning of that alliance was that it was the French Navy is what he needed. The British Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, had so far had a stranglehold on the American coast. And that meant that any victory Washington might have on land would be quickly negated by the fact that there were these fleets of powerful warships. And I think it's hard for us to understand what a ship of the line they were known as. The typical ship of the line was a 74, which meant that it had 74 cannons. It took 2,000 oak trees to construct a 74, 57 acres of forest, 500 to 750 men. They didn't use any fossil fuels. They used the sea to transport themselves. And if just one of these showed up, they had more artillery firepower than just about all of Washington's army. And so these were very powerful, sophisticated technological entities. And if Washington could use the French Navy to negate the stranglehold that the British had on the coast and create naval superiority just for a moment, that would create the window by which he might deliver the blow by land that would win this war. And so as early as 1778, he's desperately trying to get the French Navy to cooperate with him. Admiral d'Estaing arrives that summer. Unfortunately, it was a very long crossing across the Atlantic, and the British slip out of Philadelphia and make their way. The British Navy makes its way to New York. D'Estaing then can't get over the sandbar at the entrance to the New York harbor and gives up an attempt to get the Navy that's trapped in the harbor. And then a few weeks later, off of Newport, Rhode Island, it's looking like there's going to be the battle, that cataclysmic encounter, when a storm, perhaps a hurricane, destroys both fleets, and it's off. And that's in the summer of 1778, in the summer of 1779, and throughout 1780, there's nothing from the French. And what made this complicated was a colonial rebellion had turned into a world war. So France was in the war, their ally, the Spain, was in it as well. And this being a world war, it's hard for us to understand, but in the 1780, the Caribbean was where the real money was. They were worth much more to the European powers than the United States. And so the French and British navies, along with some Spanish ships, spent those years battling it out for the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean. And Washington despaired that he would ever see the French Navy sail up from the Caribbean. At one point, he says it's as if a chasm has sprung up between us and the French Navy. It's looking really bad in the fall of 1780, and if nothing happens in this year, the French have made it clear that they're going to pull the plug, and we're going to have to negotiate. And then, in October of 1780, something happens to begin a sequence of events that would change everything. Within just a year would come the naval battle. You know, we all know about the victory of Yorktown, and we think of that as the victory that won us our independence. But what is less appreciated is that was preceded by a naval battle between the British and the French that made that siege at Yorktown a fait accompli. It's called the Battle of the Chesapeake, fought between Admiral de Grasse and Admiral Graves, just off the entrance of the Chesapeake, between a fleet of almost 30 ships in the line on each side. And for the first and the last time, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, the French would defeat the British. And this would mean that the British fleet that had sailed down from New York was unable to rescue Lord Cornwallis, who had dug into Yorktown at the end of the peninsula formed by the York and James rivers. Washington and Rochambeau, with General Rochambeau, whose army was stationed in Newport, teamed up with Washington and New York, had marched down to Williamsburg and then surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. This meant that siege was a fait accompli. But the common popular narrative of the Revolution really ignores that battle because there no Americans participated in it. In this book, I want to put the sea where it properly belongs when it comes to the victory at Yorktown, center stage in the story. And the sequence of events that lead to this begins in October of 1780, when a hurricane, one of the biggest that had ever been seen, strikes the waters between Jamaica and Spanish-occupied Cuba. I talk about what happens to the British frigate Phoenix that gets driven onto the shore of Cuba and destroyed. And then just a few days later comes a second hurricane. And I'd like to read read a short passage from the first chapter of In the Hurricane's Eye that talks about what happens next. On October 10th, what came to be called the Great Storm of 1780 hit the island of Barbados. By the following day, virtually every house, including those built of stone, had been leveled to the ground, and 6,000 inhabitants were dead. Many of the cannons at Fort James, which the young George Washington had visited almost 30 years earlier, were hurled more than 100 feet through the air. The extraordinary surge of water and wind carried a ship so far onto shore that it landed on top of the island's hospital. The hurricane-whipped rain stripped the trees of bark, indicating the winds at Barbados must have exceeded 200 miles an hour. A similar scene of destruction occurred at St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Martinique, where a convoy carrying several thousand French troops was blown out to sea. One estimate puts the total death count of the Great Storm of 1780 at 22,000, making it the deadliest hurricane in recorded history. And then on October 18, 2 days after a Spanish fleet of 74 ships bearing 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Bernardo de Galvez departed from Havana to attack Pensacola, a third hurricane struck. Known today as Solano's hurricane for the admiral in charge of the fleet, the storm ravaged the Gulf of Mexico for 3 days and ultimately drove the remains of the Spanish fleet back to Cuba. With dozens of vessels sunk and dismasted and hundreds of soldiers and sailors drowned, Solano and Galvez reluctantly decided to postpone the attack until the following year. It would take the English, French, and Spanish months, if not years, to recover from the 3 hurricanes of October 1780. When British Admiral George Rodney, who'd spent the late summer and fall in New York, arrived at Barbados in early December, he was astounded by what he saw. "Had I not been an eyewitness," he wrote to his wife, "nothing could have induced me to have believed it. More than 6,000 persons perished and all the inhabitants ruined. The hurricane proved fatal to 6 ships of my squadron." The lesson was impossible to ignore. Given the seasonal dangers of this storm-battered string of islands, the best place for a navy in the summer and fall was anywhere but the Caribbean. Up until this point, France had viewed a naval expedition to the north on the behalf of the United States as a possibility, but hardly a priority. After that horrendous October, a different attitude prevailed. And thus begins the string of events. And it's not a linear string of events. I think the hurricane is kind of the perfect metaphor for the year of Yorktown. A swirling series of forces out of anyone's control, random events that seem to have nothing to do with each other, all of which had to occur for the victory at Yorktown to happen. And there in the center is Washington, doing his best to hold steady amid these forces that are threatening to blow the revolution apart and his country along with it. You know, Washington is someone I think most of us think of as permanently attached to a horse. But the fact of the matter is, he knew the water, and he knew it well. The book begins with a vignette describing Washington in a vessel picking up the French emissary in Fishkill, New York, boarding on a boat and sailing down to West Point, where he was going to give him a tour of the American fortress. Much to their surprise, Washington is the one at the helm. And if you've ever been on the Hudson River, the highlands are these mountains on either side, and gales will shriek out of those mountains. And sure enough, a squall comes out of the mountains and threatens to capsize the boat. Washington insists on holding the tiller and steers them through it. And the secretary to the French emissary says, clearly, Washington had skills that we were not aware of. He grew up in the Tidewater, and as you all know, there are rivers here. There's the Chesapeake. He owned a schooner at Mount Vernon. As a young man, he had accompanied his stepbrother, Lawrence, on a trip to Barbados. It was not necessarily a fun voyage for him. He came down with smallpox, but that would inoculate him effectively to the disease, which would add to his indestructibility when it came to the future events. But he understood the sea. But that also meant that the sea is a wilderness, and it's a wilderness that is uncontrollable in many ways, which meant that when it came to trying to coordinate an army and a navy, the chances of it all working, particularly when there are thousands of miles separating it, given the lack of communication in the 18th century, meant it was a very difficult thing to have happen. In December of 1780, soon after these hurricanes make it clear to the powers in France that sending their fleet north the next fall, the next hurricane season, will be a wise idea, the British decide to send a new brigadier general, General Benedict Arnold, the traitor, who is now a British general. They decide to send him from New York to the Chesapeake. Arnold quickly shows that he's probably one of the best generals on both sides. He works his way up the James River at lightning speed, attacks and burns the war capital of Richmond, sending Governor Thomas Jefferson fleeing in desperation. And soon he's down in Newport, Virginia, creating a naval base for the British. And he was effective, but he was a traitor not only in the eyes of the Americans, and this infuriated the Virginia militia, who came out in droves, but he was also regarded as a traitor by his own officers, and it was a very uneasy alliance. Washington is infuriated. He sends down Lafayette to deal with Benedict Arnold, and then there's other stuff happening to the south. Lord Cornwallis is rampaging through the Carolinas. Washington has sent Nathaniel Greene down to try to deal with what remains of the American army after a great defeat under Horatio Gates at Camden. Nathaniel Greene is one of the great unheralded generals of the Revolution. He was raised a Quaker in Rhode Island. Not much formal education, but he was a voracious reader, and he taught himself military tactics. And he would play a fascinating cat and mouse game with Cornwallis. There would be the race across the breadth of North Carolina to the Dan River at the Virginia border, where Cornwallis burned his luggage wagons in an attempt to catch up to Greene. Greene made it and then had the time he needed to rebuild his army and finally face the British at Guilford Courthouse on a wooded hillside. It's one of the great battles, and it's really a bloody draw, but the English can claim victory because they still have possession of the field at the end. But Greene had delivered a devastating blow to Cornwallis. He retires to Wilmington, North Carolina to pull himself together, but goes on the offensive once again into Virginia, takes over the army that Arnold had brought into Virginia, and another cat and mouse game with Lafayette until finally he's at Yorktown. And it's now, now the forces are beginning to swirl in the Caribbean. This is a very frustrating time for Washington. I was surprised in writing this book, the emotional mood swings that Washington has in this year. The tensions were immense as he was attempting to work with the French to get this fleet there, and the French feared that the American war effort would just fall apart. And if that happened, they had plans to evacuate Rochambeau's 5,000-man army from Newport and just abandon North America. Can you imagine if that had happened? And so the government told Rochambeau to not share with Washington the location of the French fleet in the Caribbean. This drove Washington crazy. Finally, he read about de Grasse's fleet's activities in the Caribbean in the newspaper. He confronts Rochambeau with what's going on. Washington was hopeful that the French Navy would attack New York, where a more than 10,000-man British army was stationed. What he needed was a big enough victory that would force the British to the negotiating table and end this. And only in New York were there that many men. Gradually, however, Cornwallis, with an army of 7,000 British and Hessian troops, would end up there in Yorktown, giving them another target. By this time, the French have decided, we're not going to New York, we're going to the Chesapeake. When Washington hears of this on August 14, he's irate because he's fine with going to the Chesapeake, but bring the ships to New York first so you can transport our army down. He had a very good understanding of the use of naval superiority, but no, they're going to have to march 500 miles to Yorktown. Washington completely shifts gears and heads down, not sure of where de Grasse is. They just know he's headed to the Chesapeake. They're in Philadelphia. They've made it out of the Hudson and through New York and New Jersey. And Henry Clinton, the British commander in New York, has just realized, oh my gosh, they're not attacking me. They're going after Cornwallis. And it's too late. Washington and Rochambeau are on their way, but they have had no word from de Grasse. Washington is on his horse near Chester, Pennsylvania, when he hears that de Grasse has arrived in the Chesapeake. He turns his horse around, goes back to the waterfront, just as Rochambeau, who's been coming down the Delaware River by boat with his retinue, sees a man on the waterfront jumping up and down, waving his hat and handkerchief. Washington has been a very staid, unemotional man. Who could this be? It is Washington. He had to express the elation. On they go. They continue south. He stops at Mount Vernon for the first time in 6 years. He has a group of grandchildren he has never met. They're just for a few days. They spread out the maps and plan the assault there in Mount Vernon and then head down. And it's just after leaving Mount Vernon that Washington hears the British fleet has arrived and de Grasse has sailed out of the Chesapeake, and no one knows what has happened. Washington is, oh my goodness, because in the history of naval warfare, the British always seem to win. He gets there and he learns that, yes, the French have won. And I'm not going to go into the details of the Battle of the Chesapeake. That's why you got to get the book. But what I will say, it's quite a battle. You know, it goes back and forth each way. It's been said, and I think it's right, given the consequences, this is the most important naval battle in the age of sail in the history of the world. I mean, everything rode on this battle. The French are victorious. Washington and Rochambeau arrive. They move out of Williamsburg, and thus begins the siege that forces Cornwallis to surrender. Now, I was hoping throughout this that finally Washington would have a high-five moment. Yes, after 6 years, we've done it. It would be another 2 years before the war would be officially over with the evacuation of the British. But soon after the siege of Yorktown, Washington's stepson, Jackie Custis, comes down with camp fever, and Washington is at his bedside when he dies. This means as the country is celebrating, Washington and Martha are back at Mount Vernon in mourning. For 2 more years, the negotiations are going on. Washington is fearful he's going to lose his officers. They haven't been paid. Continental Congress does not have the ability to tax the American people. The states are showing no interest. They're stationed on the Hudson River at Newburgh, and Washington is forced to put down what is known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, in which his officers threatened to march on Philadelphia and force Congress to pay them by gunpoint. This would have been the military coup that would have destroyed this revolution. He gets through that. His army is dispersed as the British evacuation approaches. Most of his officers are irate at him for selling them out without getting some kind of deal. He has a farewell with the officers that have remained loyal to him at Fraunce's Tavern in New York, and a very emotional farewell. He gets on a barge and goes across to Jersey and makes his way to Annapolis, where the Congress is relocated because they're afraid to remain in Philadelphia, that the Continental Army might come after them. So they're holed up in Annapolis, and it is there that Washington will surrender his commission. And I'd like to end by reading a short few paragraphs from the end of In the Hurricane's Eye. Not until December 23rd, by which time Congress had managed to assemble a quorum of just 20 legislators, did Washington stride into the State House in Annapolis. The galleries were packed with people. When Washington stood to make his speech, his right hand trembled so badly that he had to hold it with his left. Having now finished the work assigned me, he read, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and make my leave of all the employments of public life. By the end of 1783, the United States was a facade of a country, a collection of squabbling states with the barest window dressing of a federal government. Washington might have looked at the assembly of mostly second- and third-rate politicians now in control of the country and convinced himself he must do something about it. But he had had enough. He wanted to go home. When told by the American-born painter Benjamin West that Washington planned to retire to his farm after the war, King George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Washington had long since learned that greatness was attained not by insisting on what was right for oneself, but by doing what was right for others. As he had written to Admiral de Grasse, a great mind knows how to make personal sacrifices to secure an important general good. He also understood that this required a leader to attend to the countless, largely unappreciated details that made something as complicated as an army or a nation work. I have undergone more than most men are aware of, he wrote to Richard Henry Lee in 1777, to harmonize so many discordant parts. Washington could be forbidding and remote, but there was also a surprising gentleness about him that instilled a remarkable sense of loyalty to just about everyone who had the privilege to serve under him. Perhaps Abigail Adams put it best. He possesses a dignity that forbids familiarity mixed with an easy affability that creates love and reverence. Greatness, Washington realized, was ultimately determined by that sternest and cruelest of judges, posterity, by insisting that it is our duty to make the best of our misfortunes and not to suffer passion to interfere with our interest in the public good. He was acting on what he had called in the summer of 1781 the Great Scale. Now, 2 years later, it was time for him as military commander to step aside. For this Republican experiment to succeed, the young country's next hesitant steps must be made without him. It was an approximately 50-mile ride from Annapolis to Mount Vernon. Over the course of the last 8 years, Washington had slept in 280 different houses. But this time he was headed home. Accompanying him were his enslaved manservant Billy Lee and his 2 aides, David Humphreys and Benjamin Walker. By the evening of the following day, Christmas Eve, they had Mount Vernon in sight. Washington had spent the Revolution trying to convince an army and a nation that, despite all evidence to the contrary, the future was theirs. Now that the future had finally arrived, there was no place he'd rather be than here, at his beloved Mount Vernon, on a hill overlooking a river, almost 200 miles from the open sea. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
When the Spanish were sailing from Cuba in the storm of 1780 to go to Pensacola, who were they fighting?
Yes. The Spaniards had joined the alliance with the French because they also had, and you know, we think of France in this to help us. Their main motivation was to take it to Spain, because to Britain, because they had been humiliated during the 7 Years' War in the previous decade, and so they wanted to win back. They had a program known as revenge, and so they had purposely retooled their navy and with an hope of getting back to the status they had been, and their navy was large, but it was not as large as the British, so they needed the Spanish to help them. And so based there in the Caribbean, the Spaniards had their own agenda, and what they wanted were the possessions they had lost, which was primarily Florida. The British were at Pensacola. And so before Admiral de Grasse could sail north to North America, he had to help the Spanish get Pensacola. They would do it in May of 1781, and this would allow ultimately the French to sail north. But there would be other complications as well, particularly financial. This was before wire transfers and ATMs, and the French Navy needed money. They needed gold coins to pay for this war effort, and de Grasse tried to get the money he needed from the planters of what's now Haiti, but they refused to come up with it. And one of the unheralded heroes of this year is a Spanish envoy named Francisco Saavedra. He suggested to de Grasse, who was at this point saying, I just can't go with this. I'm going to have to give up on this attempt. Saavedra says, no, if you go to Cuba, the Spanish gold and silver mines, kept that island stocked with gold. If you go there, you can probably get the loan you need. Sure enough, before they sail north, they sail to Havana, where they secure 500,000 Spanish pesos from the citizens of Cuba. And so, a loan from the people of Cuba was absolutely essential to our winning our independence. And once again, this shows you the international nature of this conflict.
Hi. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was a book by Admiral Thayer about the importance of sea power. This became a very influential book. I think my timeline is right. I was just wondering if he Thayer himself was influenced by any of Washington's ideas about the importance that Washington put on sea power.
Yeah, Washington's understanding of sea power has been appreciated by others. One of the things I wanted to get at in this research was, and Washington's ability at sea is amazing. His name of his home, Mount Vernon, is named for a British admiral. So, there's an element of the sea that I think is unappreciated when it comes to Washington's abilities. But and yes, it has been a part, obviously, of naval historians. But one of the things I wanted to get at was many of those histories tend to rely largely on the British accounts because they're in English. The French accounts, the logbooks exist in archives in France, and many of them early in the 20th century were copied in our copies of them at the Library of Congress. And I can read French, but not at a level that can deal with an 18th century French log. And so I enlisted a wonderful translator from Quebec. Together we learned French naval terminology. And it was, every book has aha moments, but it was in reading the translations of these ship's logs, of the letters from the various captains, that really gave me a new appreciation for this battle. When Admiral de Grasse is when this battle begins, his fleet is anchored right at the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay, and they see this great big British fleet sailing down on them. The problem is the tide is coming in, which means de Grasse's fleet cannot sail out against the tide, and it's rushing the British fleet towards them. This does not look good, even though Admiral de Grasse has a larger fleet. Luckily, in 2 hours' time, around noon, the tide shifts. Finally, de Grasse is able to unleash his ships. And for only the second time in the history of the French Navy, he orders his men to leave in what is known as a ligne de vitesse. My French pronunciations are terrible, a line of speed. Usually they would create a line of battle that was the arrangement of which was understood prior to that, and the admiral would put every ship in its proper place, and each ship knew where to go. But in this, it meant that your line of battle would be in the order of the ship, how the ships got out. So the first one out would lead the vanguard, and so it becomes this race to get out there. And I'm an old sunfish racer. And in fact, in 1973, when I was 17 years old, I sailed in the Sunfish North Americans at Fort Monroe, Virginia, right about 20 miles from Yorktown. And I wasn't into the Battle of the Chesapeake when I was 17, but I have sailed in those waters. And as a sailor, it was remarkable to read the logbooks of these are ships of the line. These are massive vessels, and they're heading out of the anchorage, and it's a race. It's a race, just like I would participate in the Sunfish, but it's ships of the line. And so you have these captains describing how they're tacking back and forth as they struggle to get out and ramming into each other as they jockey to be as far in the lead as possible. And so, it was those French sources that really gave me a fun perspective on the battle. Yes?
I had a question. It seems like it's kind of surprising that there's all this new body of work coming out about the Revolutionary War, but you've done 2 books. David Hackett Fisher, I think his name is, he's done 2 excellent books. Some of Thomas Fleming's books are really good. Maybe you've answered it because of the archival availability, but I'm just curious, is it just because it's such a fascinating time that authors keep looking back at it, or?
Yeah, well, I write my books, they just organically evolve from each book. And, I'd never seen myself launching into the American Revolution, particularly for this as deep a dive as I've done. But, this is the genesis of our country. This is where it all began. And what I've found fascinating is watching the progression of a revolution, as a rebellion to a war, and ultimately, as you see at the end, as this in the final 2 years after Yorktown and before the evacuation of the British, you begin to see, where is it going to go? How is it going to become a country? And I think this is, it's the beginning of our nation. And this country was born in a revolution. Every generation experiences its own revolution as the ideals in the Constitution get reinterpreted for that generation. And what becomes clear is, we have a sense when you look back that it was a different time. These were people who understood where they were going. They had a plan, stuck to it, and created the democracy we have. Baloney. No one had a plan. They were making it up as they went along. They had all sorts of motivations, some altruistic, some very selfish. And the more you look at it, the more it is truly a miracle that it all fell together, and that the ideals that inspired it were not completely blown away by the end. And I think and that's where I find Washington is so important to all of this. I mean, it's so clear by that year of Yorktown. Without him there, cajoling the French, going through temper tantrums, always calming down, always, okay, I've expressed myself, now I will continue in a professional manner because we need to accomplish a goal here. Without him, it just would have all fallen apart. There was just no one of his stature. And so for me, it's been an amazing 8 years. What I've also enjoyed about it is I live on Nantucket. I began by writing basically a local book in the hurricane, in the heart of the sea and away offshore, which is my first history book about Nantucket. And I am now, I guess I'm in the process of chronicling America, but not necessarily in any kind of order. What I really enjoy is going to different regions. I went west with the Battle of Little Bighorn, although it does begin with a riverboat. And what I've enjoyed about this process is going from New England to the Middle States and now the South, and watching those very insular areas gradually becoming less so as this army from people from all over the country is creating in microcosm what the Union will ultimately become. And so it's a war where you see the beginnings of America, but you also see how tenuous it was all the way through. Yeah.
How'd you like the movie Ron Howard made of In the Heart of the Sea?
In the Heart of the Sea. It was such a pleasure to work with Ron Howard. It really was. Yeah, and he really is just terrific. And hey, it's a movie. It's exciting. I have to say as a sailor, the on the water stuff is some of the best on the water I've ever seen. It's totally emotionally involving and very accurate. And when it comes to the specifics of whaling, those scenes are amazing. I mean, they really have a documentary usefulness in how they show the brutality, the excitement, and just the bloodiness of whaling. And so, it was a fun process, and I'm actually in it very briefly. I am. You won't recognize me. I'm a Quaker. No glasses on, wig. I looked like my mother, dressed like a pilgrim, but it was a wonderful experience.
Not trying to. Is there also kind of an evolving sense with all the recent scholarship about like Hamilton and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, all of whom were well-educated and brilliant and in many ways flawed, that Washington was sort of less well-educated but had more humility and common sense than any of them, and that he was sort of the indispensable man, not just during the Revolution, but in the formation of the government?
Yeah, in the subtitle, I refer to the genius of George Washington. And I think he really was a genius, but he was a very different kind of genius from someone like Hamilton. Hamilton had that jittery intelligence. He was just off the charts, could dive into things and learn tremendous amounts, incredibly articulate. Washington's had that ability to sort through the static of life and figure out what was the most important thing to do. In the early years of the Revolution, it was really hard for him, but he came to the understanding, with the help, by the way, of Nathaniel Greene, who would write a letter that sort of laid it all out, that in the interests of his country, he would have to put his aggressive tendencies aside and fight a defensive war, the rope-a-dope kind of thing. I mean, he just had to hang in there, and this was tough for him, but he did that. The French alliance comes, and he realizes it's naval superiority. This is it. It's the only way we can win this thing. And, it wouldn't go the way he wanted to all the time, particularly when it came to the Chesapeake versus New York. But it was that strategic understanding that would ultimately be realized in a situation in which no one had control. I mean, the French the French would look back and say, "Oh, poor Washington, he didn't understand. We had it all figured out." But when they decided to go to the Chesapeake, Cornwallis wasn't yet at Yorktown. It's, why Cornwallis remained at Yorktown is still a mystery. If he had decided with the arrival of de Grasse to then retreat into the Carolinas, he would have escaped and there would have been no great American victory. But he remained there, and that's what made it all work. There was just no way to anticipate all this. And so, yes, the strategy was his. The French, Washington followed the French. It all worked. This was one of those things. Everything had to happen, from that loan from the Spaniards to the Spanish victory at Pensacola. All of these isolated things had to happen for the victory to fall into place. And and looking at Washington's career after the Revolution, he would in the years after his so-called retirement, which would not be much of a retirement, he would come to realize that the Union was everything. This is what he needed to do. And the book I'm working on now is about a road trip book. I'm changing it up. It's a travelogue. When Washington became president, he decided he needed to visit all 13 states to instill a sense of nationhood. He knew he was governing 13 independent states that really weren't all that hot about subjecting themselves to a federal government. And so he went on a road trip, visiting all 13 states, going into those little towns, and through the sheer force of his charismatic personality, creating a sense of nationhood. And so my wife and I and our dog are following George. And but he knew it was the Union, and he followed that through. And that's the great message of his farewell address at the end of his presidency. And by then, he's beginning to realize the greatest threat to the Union is slavery. And yes, he was a slave owner. He was also a land baron. He was by no means perfect. But he is the one founding father who is grappling with this in a very personal way, and is the only slaveholding founding father who, at the end of his life, would free the slaves he owns, and thereby providing an example. And, he's a fascinating individual. And he's overheard at one point during his second term saying, if he could see that the slavery issue could ultimately divide this country, which by his second term was fracturing into two parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, and almost north-south. And he was overheard to say at one point, if it comes down to this, I would go with the northern part, which is very interesting. This is someone who was willing to turn his back on his own state for the Union. And so, so for my money, Washington is the founding father that whose example is important and well worthy of continued study. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. If you've not purchased the book yet, they're available at the register.